Thank you for watching. It's time for talk. Each evening at this time, Monday through Friday, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. Time for Talk is a community betterment service. Tonight, Rosemary takes us by means of portable camera out of our studios and maybe into your neighborhood. And now, it's time for Talk.
Hope you get this magazine. It is excellent. It has articles in here. The one that caught our eye was A Prairie in the Swamp, and we did a program with the gentleman who wrote this, A.J. Hendershot, and he's sitting right here with us. He brought a map, and if you caught that earlier program, you watched us as we outlined the prairies in Missouri. Did you know that Caruth sits on a dome that was called Grand Prairie in those days? We're talking 1840s when the surveyors did the early maps. But today, we want to do a different kind of program. You brought two maps, and I find them fascinating. We talked about the prairies and the swamps. Now, how do you categorize this second map we're going to talk about?
This is looking at how southeast Missouri was shaped, and looking at that history, you find out why we have what we have today. Some of the richest ground in Missouri is right here in the Boot Heel. And that has everything to do with a long history of geology and ecology that went on, and it helps to understand that, so as land managers from the Department of Conservation can do a better job of managing our land. We can also let farmers have a good appreciation for the land they do have and what value it is to them.
Okay, our early information about this area, it was always interesting to me. They would say the Boot Heel of Missouri, in fact, they couldn't really survey it accurately at first, and they said the Boot Heel of Missouri is 30 miles wide and 3 feet deep. And they just complained about how they just couldn't do it at first. You're going to tell us how we got this way, why we were so low, and why we were so swampy.
There you go.
Okay, now, as we did before, he has brought great big maps, and the only place we can really get a view of them is to put them on the floor. So go with us over here, and you're going to learn a lot about the state of Missouri.
All right, Rosemary, I have a series of maps here that I use, and when I get a chance to teach a class on southeast Missouri, I just love to talk about the history of how our area got to look like it did. And in these maps, we have different types of information being represented. From the general viewer, they're going to look at it and say it's a bunch of swirly old colors on maps, and it actually means something to those who know what these maps are for. For example, this is a soil map, and that tells us what type of soil is on the surface. As I go over here to take a look at this map, this map shows the general topography, also known as relief. This tells you whether something has a lot of hills and valleys, whether there's a lot of variation in the land. And as you take a look at the Ozarks, you'll see a lot of variation. The colors,
pretty colors, yeah.
There's a lot of color, and they're very closely packed together. That shows you these are hilly areas with a lot of valleys. But when you drive down here in southeast Missouri, you see that color is just about all one color. That tells us we don't have a lot of relief. And when you see slight variations in the relief, that's when you get interesting things to happen down here in southeast.
Okay, what are the two little colors we do have down in southeast?
Okay, you're talking about this feature right here and here?
Yeah.
Okay, there's a geologic structure that's known as Crowley's Ridge and the Benton Hills. Now, I consider the Crowley's Ridge and Benton Hill to all be related, but geologists like to separate them. The Benton Hills are actually almost like an island of hills surrounded by lowland soil. Over here you have Crowley's Ridge, which actually stretches all the way down into Arkansas before it comes back and touches the Mississippi River again. And at one time, the Mississippi River used to run down through this area, through Advance, down along Poplar Bluff and into the Ozark section of Arkansas before it finally met up with the Ohio way further down south. And through a series of Ice Age events, there have been floods that have choked this little Mississippi River and caused it to pour over the Crowley's Ridge and to scour out new areas. In fact, that's part of the interesting story of how we got our sand prairies. It's also part of how we got our swamps. A lot of things in the...
Sorry, start again.
Sure thing. This is a map that takes into consideration soil type, bedrock, what type of plants did live here, what can live here, and it shows us our land types. And that's really useful from a standpoint of trying to manage the land. It's difficult to try to force the land to do something that it's not meant to do, and the department has struggled with that. And in some areas, we may try to encourage white pine, or let's say we plant shortleaf pine where it doesn't grow, and then maybe we should be planting something else like white oak. And that helps us to understand what lives where and why, and it helps us to manage more effectively. This map over here is a combination map of the pre-settlement Prairie of Missouri. You'll notice that most of the Prairie is on the western and the northern side of the state, with exception to some of it down here in the Boot Heel. Then you'll see a blob of green and light green, and that has to do with where pine used to be. We had a lot of pine, a lot more than what you'll see today, and there was mixed pine with a little bit of the hardwoods, and now the department is realizing some of those sites really do make some of the best pine, and that pine is a valuable resource for us to manage. It's very good for wildlife, and it's also very good for the lumber industry. This map is a bedrock map, and it tells you what is underneath the soil, and that has influence on your acidity. For example, in the St. Francis Mountain area, those who have been up to Elephant Rock State Park or Tom Sauk, you know that that area has some big pink igneous rock, or maybe it's gray, and that rock allows for more acidic soil, much as sand will. If you go over in the river hills over along Cape Girardeau and Perry County, St. Genevieve County, there's a lot more limestone or sometimes dolomite. Well, that limestone is more basic. It's more like soap. Your pH is not going to be nearly as acidic. And although that doesn't seem like something that's very interesting, it makes a lot of difference when you take a look at what plants will live there. There are some plants like azaleas that love acid soil, and then you have some plants like certain ferns. They only live in very basic soil, not so acidic. So these maps are really useful when we try to think about what lives where, how do we manage it, how do we
now
get the
you
most
said
out of it.
rock. What about this down in southeast Missouri? We don't have red. We don't have what's underneath us?
Oh, that's a good question. Southeast Missouri has a really neat history. When you take a look at this map, you won't see a lot in the way of bedrock, and that's because we have very thick amounts of gravel, sand, and soil, and you have to dig down very far to actually reach some of the limestone that's down there. And we don't necessarily have a great view of what that looks like, because it is so deep. And the way this all formed is an interesting story. Okay, whenever you look at the Mississippi River today, you see this enormous river that's one of the largest in the continent, but it hasn't always been that way. Before the end of the last ice age, this was a very small river, not much bigger than the St. Francis River.
Now, when you talk about ice age, you're talking 10,000 years ago.
When we had a glacier sitting on the north half of Missouri.
Okay, north half, and it came down where?
Right along, in fact, the borders of the Missouri River almost mark where that last glacier was.
Okay, and how thick was it?
That was a glacier that was at least a mile thick.
And I have read 3 miles thick.
Which is a phenomenal amount of water. You think about how much that is.
Mind.
Yeah, it's just hard to, it's staggering.
So the ice came down, and when it began to melt, we had all kinds of water.
Right, and that
down.
water was coming down through our part of the world. So you can imagine what happened to this little ditch we call the Mississippi River. So it began to scour through here, and there were enormous ice age floods that built up in the river channel. Now you have to understand the Mississippi didn't always run where it does today. It used to take a sharp turn to the west, right around Cape Girardeau, and it went down through Advance, through what is called Mingo National Wildlife Refuge, and then down past Poplar Bluff into Arkansas. Of course, Arkansas didn't exist at that time yet, but we'll talk about it anyways. All right, so you have all these huge volumes of water, and we're talking about water levels that are well over 90 to 100 feet deep in some places, which is a lot of water. We've seen floods, but we've never seen floods like this. So it builds up, there's ice coming down with it, and it gets jammed up in natural constrictions. And when you look at this constriction right here at Puxico, Missouri, that's a good place for an ice dam to build up. Water is moving so quickly through here that it just can't get out quick enough. It's like you have the bathtub turned on full blast, and your drain's not big enough to handle it all, and eventually it's going to fill up and overflow. Well, that's exactly what happened. In fact, it began to break in various locations. You can see where it broke across Crowley's Ridge. And
okay, now you're saying at Puxico was the ice jammed the Mississippi.
Right.
Is the
and
water?
It's backing up into this area, and
Okay.
and then when that finally started to spill over Crowley's Ridge and the Benton Hills, When it broke, it's just like when the levees broke on the 93 flood. You had an enormous flow of water. It moved fast. It started picking up sediment and ripping down through here. Well, what had happened before that area broke, this was all alluvial soil that was deposited by the Ohio River. The Ohio was depositing gravel and very fine sand all throughout this delta. And you had areas where you had bayous and you had oxbows and different sections of the river. So it looked a lot like it did today, but the river channel was in a different spot. So the Ohio's running through here, depositing a lot of sand, but when Crowley's Ridge breaks and the Mississippi decides, I'm taking this over, it rips down through here and absolutely scours out layers, feet, maybe yards thick of soil and sand. Well, all the sand that's left here on the Malden Ridge, it didn't get scoured out. So that sand, which was deposited by the Ohio River, is still there. The Mississippi now has a new channel and it starts to run through here and meander much like a river should. Well, the Ice Age flooding wasn't over, and several thousand years later, it jams up again around Cape Girardeau, and then it breaks through a section called Thebes Gap. It cuts off the Benton Hills from Illinois, and it starts to take pretty much the channel that we know today. Well, this sand ridge that runs right here through Sykeston is also not scoured. So you have two erosional remnants because everything around them was eroded. These areas that were scoured out now become great places for water to sit. It doesn't drain very well, and it now begins to deposit organic material, trees that are dying, and all kinds of aquatic vegetation that drain from the Missouri and Mississippi River gather in here. Plus you have swamps contributing and marshes, and this becomes some of the most fertile ground we have. Whereas the sandy ridges are much drier, they're much more inhospitable, they're hotter, and that's where we have our prairie. Our swamp down here is in some of the lowest sections of the scouring. Areas that are transition between the swamp and the actual sand ridges are what we call fertile soil terraces, and that's where you have the best trees. That's where you're going to have enormous trees that are 18 feet in circumference, 90 to 120 feet tall, and that's where your timber industry really boomed in the early to middle 1900s. And all of that is what makes Southeast Missouri what it is today. I want to talk a little bit about some of the neat things about Crowley's Ridge and the Benton Hills, because at one time this was all connected to southern Illinois and Kentucky and Tennessee. Well, if you've been over to the Appalachians, that's more of a tulip poplar beech forest mixed in with oaks and hickories. You don't see as much tulip poplar and beech in the middle of the Ozarks. You see pine and oak and hickory. Well, down here in Crowley's Ridge, we have a lot of plants and animals that you find over in the Appalachians, and you don't see them as much in the rest of the Missouri. For example, there is a little darter that lives, I'm sorry, not a darter, a cavefish that lives in the Benton Hills that otherwise has other relatives in southern Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee.
So you're saying there was continuity?
Yeah, there was a connection, and you could walk from Benton, Missouri over to Karnak, Illinois, and you'd never get your feet wet. Today, that's not possible because of the Mississippi River, so that certainly has been cut off. There's another darter that lives here on Crowley's Ridge that you'll find only on Crowley's Ridge in Arkansas and Missouri. Otherwise, you have to go over in the Appalachians to find this thing. So whenever you get on these ridges, if you take the time to learn your plants a little bit, or at least pay attention to, does this look like it does in the swamp or in the boot heel, it is different. It's a different world, and this is some of the most biologically diverse area in the whole state. Crowley's Ridge has influence from the Appalachians, from the lowland swamps, and from the Ozarks. And when you have those three types of communities, that makes for incredible diversity. And if you were to put a diversity indicator on here with a red light, and the paler it is, the less diversity, and the more intense, the brighter it is, you would have bright red right here on Crowley's Ridge. That is the most diverse area in the whole state, and then it becomes less and less as you go farther north and west, and that has a lot to do with the water and the temperature gradient we were talking about in an earlier episode. We have the hottest temperatures in southeast Missouri, we have the highest rainfall, we have the best soil fertility, and I'm real proud of southeast Missouri. I think we live in a neat place.
Hey, I'm glad we got this gentleman here, A.J. Hendershot, you've been listening to. He likes southeast Missouri, and we like southeast Missouri. I've learned a lot about our land, about our forest, and appreciate you coming down and
tickled to do
talking
so.
with us.
Yeah,
Thank
by all
you.
means.
You have been watching Time for Talk. Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. Each evening, Monday through Friday at this time, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. If you are aware of items of interest, please let us know for possible airing on this program. Time for Talk is brought to you through the cooperation of Kennett Cablevision Incorporated and is produced through the facilities of the Slicer Street Church. The Holy Scriptures come alive. Coming up next. Stay tuned.